without further ado, who we are. So we're an e-commerce cloud, the e-commerce cloud company. We handled about $5 billion in revenue through our platform in 2017. The number's gone up substantially this year through new customers that we work with, significant number of storefronts. We've seen it all too because we have so many storefronts that we work with from a security standpoint. And that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today. Really the most common attacks and the simple things you could do as a merchant to help protect your site and avoid some of the pain that can come with being attacked. Let's see. So the most common piece here is that it's incredibly easy to attack a Magento storefront. What I see in the community typically is that it's great in that Magento is a well-maintained platform, and when a security vulnerability is discovered, Magento as a company puts out a patch and then hands you, the community, install this patch, here's the vulnerability, here's how you know if you've been compromised in this way. But then the downside here is that they also just told the bad guys how to attack you. And what I tend to find is that many merchants don't really connect the dots, and they're late to the party in terms of applying patches. And if they don't keep up with them, that's the vulnerability. And the bad guys are just out there looking for a way in. And you might say to yourself, well, I don't actually handle the credit card data. And none of you do. Most of you actually, in pretty much all of our companies that we work with, don't directly handle the credit card data anymore. It really goes through a third-party payment gateway. And so because they're not handling the credit card gateway, they start to think they get some false sense of security that, well, I'm not involved in the cardholder data environment because I don't see the credit card. That's not true. You actually are involved, and when you are compromised, the Secret Service shows up at your doorstep. And they do that in part because you're the common vector of how they got in. So I want to talk to you about the simple things that we can do to sort of set the stage for the conversation that I'd really like to have with Brent, that I'd like to bring up. Why don't you come up, Brent, and introduce yourself briefly. Brent's a master Magento architect, developer. What is the? Yeah. It's a master Magento. He's a Magento wizard. So I come at this from the infrastructure side. Our software actually sits in between the internet and your website. We also do the provisioning and security management of the platform that sits behind that service as well. And so essentially we get visibility into all of these attacks. So essentially through our storefronts, we can see all the traffic, where in the world the bad guys are coming from, how they're getting in, and then what mitigations need to be put in place to prevent them. So we'll start with, I think, let's just have a conversation, I suppose. Sure. The basis of the attacks, I mean, the top question there, how do the hackers gain access? And I think the thing that I see the most about how they gain access is really what I mentioned earlier, that Magento puts out a patch, and then they tell the world about this vulnerability, and then the merchant is slow to apply the patch. And then what we're finding, so it used to be when I first got into this, we would see botnets. We actually had a botnet attack where the botnet decided, they used it to try and DDoS the site and bring it down. We had a customer that got acquired by a big public company. And so the bad guy, I think we were Eastern European at the time, attempted to bring down the site through a DDoS attack. We defeated it, but they sent a ransomware email saying, deposit this many Bitcoin and we'll turn this off. But so we squashed the attack. But that was the last DDoS attack that I've seen directly in a very long time. But the botnets, the booter networks, are still being used pretty prolifically to attack Magento sites. And what they're doing now, because you guys are handling credit card data, you're involved in this environment, there's a better way to make money, essentially, with a booter network. So what they'll do is they set up an IP address to go after a single vulnerability or admin or phpMyAdmin. They look for this backdoor, and then they get a simple list of the hundreds of thousands of Magento storefronts in the world, and then they just ask them all, do you have this? And they don't necessarily need to execute the vulnerability. They don't need to get in and install the backdoor. They just look to see if the backdoor exists. And if it does, they then drop their own backdoor, and then they start modifying your admin, going through your admin, modifying CMS blocks to inject typically a JavaScript, so it's really a stored cross-site scripting attack on the database, where they're going to inject a JavaScript that then the browser's going to load and scrape credit card data and ship it off to some server someplace else in the world. And that's how that vector, when that happens, if it's in place long enough or there's a significant amount of credit card fraud, that the Secret Service ends up showing up at your doorstep asking you, hey, tell me about this, what have you done? You're compromised because we see all this fraud coming through you and that you need to do something about this. So even though you may say, well, I don't handle credit card data, you're still part of that environment and you have to take steps to protect it. What do you think, Brent? And have some pause there.
Yeah. So there's a couple of pieces. So we're a Magento agency. We're a solution provider. So we see it as our job to help the client to harden their Magento site. And one of those, the most important thing is always do those patches.
Yeah.
So we help in that regards. And you're exactly right. The merchants who let their incremental upgrades lapse are the ones that are most vulnerable to the attacks that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and so then, I mean, in addition to that, so some of those hardening things, there's some things that we can do as a service provider. We provide some technologies that allow you to, say, take your webheads off of the internet. That's a great step, in fact, because when you think about this, if I put a security measure in place, so you have your WAF, or in our case, I mean, we provide a WAF, so you put our WAF in place, but then if you don't eliminate internet access to those application servers, you're still vulnerable that somebody bypasses the WAF and goes to that IP address. Now, it's a bit harder because hopefully you're at least doing some kind of obfuscation, server hiding, so that if I go directly to that IP address, if I don't present with the domain, it shouldn't reply, so you should hide the server from that standpoint. But even better still would be to not allow internet access to that web server. Force all of the traffic through your security gateway so that you gain visibility into the traffic that's coming in. And so that's one of the things that we'll provide. So we take all metadata and all traffic that you've processed over the last 30 days, and it's immediately searchable through a portal. So all our customers, you can log in, and being able to get that ground truth of knowing every request that your site's processed or handled in the last 30 days, if you do discover an incident, your FIM alert goes off, something about your system identifies a change, or you see an admin that logged in through Enterprise, because you have that archive, you have the historical who's logging in as admin. You see something that you don't like, you can go look at all the traffic and what they did on the site, and that's really crucial. Because with that ground truth, you can now go investigate new vulnerability, maybe it's some other kind of attack you haven't seen. So that kind of stuff's really important.
Yeah, I think from the beginning level, what we're trying to do is not give them a point in which they can enter. And go to the point of not allowing the web servers to be exposed to the internet, that's the easiest way would just be through a load balancer, where the load balancer is exposed and your web servers have to only answer to those. And then even going down the path of what is your admin URL and whitelisting your admin URL. And then also changing the URL from every month.
From default,
changing all your,
on a regular basis.
Changing all your logins in admin every month or every 90 days or whatever it is. And then making sure that any user that are in there are dropping off. So if they're going through an inventory of users, even on a monthly basis of admin users, to make sure that there isn't an old admin user who still has access. And then the next thing would be any API keys that are there. Make sure that they're real. So that one of the things that we've seen that has happened is a backdoor gets in and creates an API, which is then is another direct way to communicate, and you wouldn't necessarily see that.
Well, one of the things we found that's actually very useful to kind of leverage that is, so typically the bad guys, they'll come in, if they get in somehow, they'll want to install a backdoor, and they know you're a PHP environment, so they're going to try and drop a piece of PHP someplace on the site. Usually hide it somewhere, maybe it's an admin, or maybe they name it something different, or they call it a JPEG, but it's actually PHP. And then they're going to try and access that from the internet. One of the simple things you can do is to eliminate that access. So essentially say, the structure of your site, what PHP files should be callable from the internet, allow those to be executed, and then prevent execution of every other PHP anything from anywhere else. Right? So it's something, we call it PHP whitelisting. We typically do that for every deployment. So essentially, we know what can be executed. We allow those files to be executable from the internet and then block everything else. And just that simple measure alone, you cut out a lot of the naive backdoor attempts. And now you're into really FIM, so you're monitoring those known PHP files to make sure they haven't been modified in any way. And so now you put those two pieces together. You prevent the execution, you monitor for change, and then you can see things, you can prevent that malicious stuff from happening.
And some of the differences between Magento 1 and Magento 2 are, Magento 2 now we're building it, And so in that build,
Yeah.
you have the opportunity
Yeah.
to deploy all the code to the
Yeah.
site every single time.
Exactly.
And if you're deploying in a release, you'll have a symlink that's going to switch on the releases, and
Yeah.
now you have new code getting deployed to the server every
Yeah.
day, which would,
Yeah.
the worst case would be that if somebody somehow got access to
Yeah.
that, they would have to put it in there, and then it would only
Yeah.
be there for a day because all
Yep.
the new code is now redeployed.
We're also, we go, because we're fundamentally an auto-scaling platform, and when you're in the cloud, you really want to assume that everything's ephemeral, right? So all servers could come and go, and that there should be nothing unique about any of the servers in that environment. And so what we typically find is, our servers, when you scale out and in, when we scale back in, we're going to eliminate the oldest server from the system. So they don't even typically stick around for that long, right? Not even a day. So at that point, cycling the servers and basically replacing everything on a regular basis, it is actually a healthy, I'd never thought of it that way, but there's a healthy security measure too, is that those servers won't live long enough to really cause harm. And then what's also fascinating about that is that the users coming to the front door, they're coming through a load balancer, in our case an ADC, that's distributing traffic. If they were to try and install something on the system and then come back, they have no way to get back to that same server. So even if they were to deposit something, server's likely going to go away relatively soon. And when they come back, the odds of them going back to that same server are really minuscule. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think earlier we had the conversation too about the var folder and the media folder on the Magento
Yeah.
side are the most exposed.
Yeah.
But you talked about scanning some of those,
Yeah.
scanning the files, say in the media folder to make sure
Definitely.
they're actual media,
Yeah.
and restricting your media to PDF and JPEG
Yeah.
and just actually images and PDFs or
Yeah.
whatever you want to keep in there.
Yeah, what's
Nothing
actually
but
media.
that.
Right.
Yeah, so you'd never allow anybody
Right.
to have PHP files or doc files or anything
Yeah.
else in your media folder.
Yeah, definitely. And then the real key piece, I think, in there is the automated, right? So if you do anything by hand, especially in the security standpoint, if you do anything by hand, the bad guy's going to win. Because at some point you'll get busy, you have an event, you have to go to a conference. You can't do your regular daily routine of monitoring. You want to be able to have automated systems that are scanning on your behalf all the time, and that they're alerting you. So when an event occurs, you see the event, and now you take action based on that event versus spending your time watching the system itself. So you want some software piece that's always doing it, that's giving you a report every day. So we do that. I mean, we actually print out we have an event stream, and so we drop the scan events of saying, yeah, it ran successfully, completed, we didn't find anything, or, and then if something was encountered, there's an alert that triggers the 24/7 support team to actually go in and diagnose and understand what's going on with that event. So.
Yeah, a real easy way to do security scans would be to set up a diff between your good
yeah, you guys
Git
do the code,
repository and your live
Yeah.
site. Nobody has
Yeah.
access to the Git, so it's in a protected folder, but your live site is there. You can scan that with a cron job every 5 minutes, and if there's
Yeah.
a diff, you just have it
Flag
send
it.
somebody an email, and
Yeah.
I mean that's just a really easy
Straightforward,
way.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, for sure. So that's kind of the front end. Any questions out there? I mean, we'll keep going, too. Is it any of this striking a chord? You want to tell us about a friend who's had an incident? Well, all right. I mean, we can keep going, too, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, sure, we can do that. So when we see something, so say one of those alerts go off, and I think it depends on which kind of alert. If it is a FIM alert that goes off, or say you monitor your code differences and you detect the difference on a system, one of the things we do is we want to quarantine that. We want to look and get to root cause, so how did it come in? We'll typically look through the traffic stream too, so we know that something happened. We identify how it happened. We're trying to get to an IP address of who the source was. Then we're going to look at everything that source did and understand, what happened to end up in this place of something there. And then what we're really looking for is the vulnerability that allowed them to gain access to that piece of the system, right? So if it's, maybe it's a PHP file that was considered part of the system and there was a security vulnerability there, and so it's kind of 0-day thing. So somebody's attacking something that no one knew about yet, and now they're getting in, and that allowed them to gain access to an elevated level of privilege. So we're going to start to control that. So typically, you see like some normal functioning piece of the site, a PHP file that's the vulnerability. we're going to block access to that to the extent that, we don't put the merchant out of business, but we're going to want to try and block that and block access. We're going to bring the merchant and the developer. Typically, if it's a partner, that's great too, but we're going to bring the developer in so that we can all look at the data and understand what's going on. Mainly, we're looking for two, well, what level of access did they get? How big was, in that we'll see like bytes out. So we track bytes in and bytes out too. So our metadata is pretty extensive and complete in terms of where they came from, what ADC they went through, what server processed the traffic, how much data came in, how much data went out, the refer, you name it. There's a really long list of attributes on every request. So we're going to be looking at all those things to identify, lots of data transfer. So this call was made or this post was made, and then something happened, and then what changed, and then where all the bytes went to see where the data moved. But really, it's about trying to identify how they got in, blocking access to that IP specifically, digging deeper on that. Is it a core vulnerability, or has that code been modified, or is there something else in the database that's been changed, and then take corrective steps. I don't know, you want to?
Yeah, no, yeah. I think that you've covered most of it. Sometimes clients will want to have a third party as a forensic person come in, and depending how big the breach is.
Yeah.
I think it's getting much easier now with Magento 2, because especially with Composer and how we're bringing files into the system, a lot of those things aren't even deployed anymore. They're pulled from a central repository. So we're deploying new code, but we're deploying in many different pieces. So we have a much thinner place to look for, or if there is a vulnerability, or if there is an attack, we have a thinner place. And I think the other thing you had mentioned earlier was even doing a periodic dump of your database and scanning for URLs or malicious URLs within a database, even as an exercise. If you haven't been, to see if there's something in your database
that you don't know about.
That's one of the hardest things. Is if somebody gets something into your database, how do you know? Because now it's dynamic.
Yeah, right. And one of the things we'll do in there, it's still more back to preventative measure. We will scan the database, take a dump of the database and then scan for URLs that we don't recognize. Or we actually have a partner with a data firm that we can actually take. We'll get the list of all external URLs, and then we'll check all of them to see if they've been flagged for malicious content. That's one preventative measure that's actually pretty helpful. In addition to that, though, just I lost my train of thought. 3 hours of sleep. I don't remember what I was going to say. The trigger. So what we'll do, we put triggers on the database that look for specific block changes. Specifically, what we're looking for is, has somebody modified this block? And so we're trying to check for when that occurred. So we'll have the trigger there, and that'll actually alert 24/7. We have a 24/7 global support team that basically, when that alert goes off, they're going to go in and diagnose and make sure, that came from this API call. That API call was coming from a whitelisted IP address. It's a known IP address for that merchant. It's all good. That's healthy transactional stuff. Versus, we see this block modification, and we can't relate it to anything, and that IP address is coming from, France or the Ukraine. Now we're escalating to everybody and getting people involved. So a bit of preventative, but did we answer your question a little bit about kind of what we do?
Watch out for the French.
Actually, it's not the French. It's that OVH, I think, has lax.
It was a joke, sorry.
What we find is, it's funny, one of the things that we look for, too, in our traffic is the data center, so where the traffic's coming from. And what we find is certain data centers on the globe, the latest one I dealt with is POT, is a Thailand service cable vendor. And their networks are really dirty. It was amazing. Like every subnet that we were looking at, all of them were flagged for malicious activity. But at any rate, there's that kind of, there's some certain somebody when you think about that too, just bots going, nobody ever bought anything from an OVH data center. So you kind of see that where you have these people coming in, where these software attacks coming at you, and they're coming from data centers. They're not people in the world trying to buy stuff. So anyway, any other questions out there, or did I bring up something for you? Yeah.
You had talked about one thing you do is into the data centers and not accessible, and where that load balancers for one way. And I wasn't sure I missed other part of that answer. Are there other techniques load balancers?
Yeah, load balancer is part of the solution. And when you think about like a load balancer, essentially all you have is it's another server. That typically it's treated as a network appliance. The different cloud vendors all provide them. Google's got one, Amazon's got ELB. We provide one as a merchant, as a vendor. It's distribution, it's really distribution of traffic. So the initial HTTP, HTTPS, that handshake's done at that device, and then it's going to route traffic to the application servers behind it. And so when we do that, we have a technology integrated, we call ours an application delivery controller. But at any rate, it's a proxy for all intents and purposes. It also has an integration into cloud providers' firewalls. So we're part of that network. And so what we do is set up a technology, we call it app shielding. We're essentially managing the firewall for the network where the application servers live. So we disconnect the application servers from the internet. We allow that private network to talk to our private network. Our private network on that cloud provider, it has an internet connection. Those are the IP addresses that you would see for that cluster of proxies. They're accepting the HTTPS handshake, and then they're proxying the traffic to the application servers. And so those application servers will accept traffic from us. The firewall rules that we're managing, that ADC cluster scales, the application cluster, server cluster scales. So it's not just straightforward. You have to do a bit of work, and that's what our control plane does, is it actually manages all of that. So you can add capacity at the ADC tier, you can add capacity at the application tier. It all happens in program time by our control plane. And then, so at any rate, those firewall rules are what control who can get in and out of that network. So what you're trying to do, right, is have that gateway act as a kind of DMZ into that cloud network, and then you want private addressing on the app tier, and then you want another private network that's separate from that, which is where the data tier runs, essentially, so that if somebody were to get into the app tier, you want to really harden the data tier. I mean, that's your cardholder data. That's where the data is actually stored, and so you want to basically limit ins and outs of that network. And so typically what we'll do is set up a Bastion server or some other technology. So you'll bridge into the DMZ and then get into the private data network from there. So that way you're not able to SSH direct into that data tier. Our customers, there's kind of, I'll say there's this like big varying scale, depending on the size of the merchant, as to the risk associated with a breach, right? And so you find the smaller merchant wants to be nimble and run fast, and so they'll take some steps to not necessarily deploy a fully hardened network. They'll actually prefer to have a little bit more flexibility but good monitoring, and it's a reasonable compromise. So does that make sense?
I mean,
Yeah.
even at the most simple level of having a server, you can whitelist your
yeah.
SSH, you can change the address as SSH.
And run SSH guard if you're in the public
Yeah.
cloud, by the way, because there are massive networks that are just constantly trying to SSH into every server with a public IP. So if you're not running SSH guard, if you don't know what that is, Google it. It's just a simple lockdown brute force login attempts. And don't use passwords. Use an SSH key with a password, preferably with two-factor on top of that. So just all good basic things to do from a security standpoint. But any other questions? Or
Yep, right back
you got another one? Yeah. Off the shelf. We use our own. It's a good thing. So you have to, right? So for PCI compliance, PCI DSS compliance says you're going to monitor your logs on a daily basis, especially like admin login attempts and activity in and out of the cardholder data environment, looking for unusual activity. There are some automated services. We provide some from what we do. I actually, that ground truth data is really useful. So because we know like all access to this application went through our gateway, that metadata is extremely useful for me to analyze behavior, to identify and flag correct use and misuse of the website itself, right? So you can easily identify bot traffic, you can identify networks that are looking for backdoors and the like, and then take action on that. So that's what we typically do. So our API, we'll use that. So you want to have your WAF, make it programmatically controllable. So that service, when it sees something in program time, it sees something that it doesn't like, you should be able to reach back in and say, capture that IP address, right? So force them to prove that they're a person, or send an alert to hey, this activity looks malicious. They're getting 200s from parts of the site or the API that they shouldn't be. So But yeah, I mean, it's an important concept, and there are tools out there. So, any other questions? I think we have a couple more minutes. Yeah.
So when you guys do have a breach and you're dealing with like a third-party forensic company,
Uh-huh.
how transparent will you be on that?
Completely, actually. So we're providing them all. So with our larger merchants too, we'll also set up an archive server beyond just our own. So you can think of, if you're familiar with sort of typical access logs, we maintain 30 days of online active metadata so we can identify a breach or identify an issue immediately. We also maintain an archive server in that network typically that's aggregating access logs from all the web heads, the error logs, the Magento logs, slow query logs, all of that onto, we usually use an Elk stack in the network, and then that'll have customer determine how many days of activity should be stored there. And then the customer has and can present that access to anybody. So anything we can do to help, we help with. And typically you get, it'll escalate through to security officer and participating in facilitating the merchant getting all of the answers that we can provide. So, and actually, so with us, sometimes we own the network as a host. We'll act as a hosting company. We also will act as a kind of management provider. So our cloud management solution, you delegate IAM credentials to us, and we reach into your cloud account and control and operate that system for you. So in that world, you have full pseudo privileges and all the access you need. And so really, we're just there acting as, well, providing whatever help we can in diagnosing, analyzing, looking at the traffic to see, the vector and what they got and, how. Make sense? So, all right. I think it seems like you guys are all here for the next talk, huh? Yeah, right. Yeah, that's okay. So I think we're out of time. We didn't get the signal that we were out of time. But I think we are. So
Go for another half an hour.
yeah, we could. What's your topic about? We could talk about that.
Here he is.
Well,
He's
yeah,
gonna-
all right.
he's gonna
Yeah.
get
Here he
us
comes.
on.
He's ready to get the hook here. I think that's. So thanks. Connect with us if we can answer questions. We're happy to. What's that?
You said the hooks at the Apollo.
Right on. Well, thanks
Thank you.
everybody.